Hello and welcome to the fourth Lights Out Racing podcast for our coverage of the 2013 Chinese Grand Prix. Okay, then straight into the news roundup, with the first story being more from what's now become known as Multi-21 Gate. Was Webber goading Vettel, and should Red Bull punish Vettel?
And also, will Mclaren actually come back to the front of the grid at the next race?
Okay, and the third story we'll be looking at is the tyre choices by Pirelli and some of the drivers' comments from this weekend.
On to the news discussed now, and first up on the agenda is Multi-21 Gate, the well-publicised Vettel and Webber dispute from the last race.
Yeah, I think the biggest development in that was Vettel's comments at the interviews on I think it was the Friday when they do the pre-race interviews, and he basically alluded to the fact that he didn't want to disobey the team, but if the situation arose, he would probably do it again because he didn't feel Mark Webber deserved to win the Grand Prix.
Yeah, there's. I think from the Chinese press conferences that he held, I think what came out was much more of the real, I think, aggravation or wounds that the relationship has suffered over the last few years. I think what you got at the end of the last race in Malaysia was a reaction to everybody else to say, "Oh my God, what have you just done?" So he said, "Okay, yeah, I'm sorry." But then I think as everyone has had a time to reflect and sort of think about the situation, he's come out and said, "Well, I apologise for disobeying the team order as such, but quite honestly, Mark has never supported the team in the past, so I don't see any reason why I should in that instance." That's the general feeling that I got. Now, whether you agree with that or not, I think is another matter generally. But I think it's well, at least it's shown is that it's definitely started to come out in the wash, I think, now.
Yeah, I think sort of what Vettel was alluding to was the fact that I think he was asked the question and he didn't deny it. He kind of said that he was inadvertently, in a way, paying Webber back for things that he had done to him over the course. And I think Brazil was mentioned actually in the interview as well while they were doing it. So it's, I think he was directly asked whether he was paying Webber back for that, and he kind of responded as a indirectly, maybe I was, kind of sort of answer. So it shows that that's definitely been simmering for a long time, and those sort of things are stuck in his mind, just waiting to come out, I think, when the need arises or the moment comes up.
Can he be punished?
But to be quite honest, I can't see how they can punish him. The only thing they can do, like we said at the end of the last podcast when we was talking about it then, the only thing they can really threaten him with is you won't have a race seat if you do it again.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's been some, or very few, historical examples which can't take to the table now, but I know that I think, there's been commentary recently about some very few examples in the past where drivers have been directly penalised for certain actions. And I'm not too sure about this one, whether it is just a general case of the fact that they can't punish him because he's too much of a superstar and he can win them the championship, because I think if you... as I say, this all goes back down to personally ironing these things out at the start, and I think back in 2010 this should have been ironed out there and then, and I think it would have been much more clearer now. I think the issue is that it hasn't quite been clarified and settled as much as I think as I think Red Bull have suggested. Basically what I'm trying to say is I think with Vettel doing it again this time round, I think you got the scenario where if you punish him, yes, you do yourselves as a team in worse, because obviously one of your drivers would be disadvantaged.
Yeah, that was sorry, just to cut in on you. Going back to saying things that have been reported in the press about it happening in previous times. I think this is the big thing the big difference this time around that has also come up in the press is in those previous instances they've generally been midfield teams and not teams that have been fighting for the championship. So like I say, they've only hindered themselves by losing a few points, whereas if Red Bull choose to do anything now, because of the situation as it stands, they put themselves in the frame for throwing away the title if they overreact or if they do end up banning him for a race. And if the points that he then loses in that race costs them the championship, that's going to, I think, look even worse than if they don't punish him.
Then on the flip side, I suppose, if Vettel and Webber crash into each other on the final race and lose both the title and the constructors, they've also lost it because they haven't resolved it. So I suppose it's it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, which goes back to my point really that I think if it's absolutely clarified right at the beginning when the seeds are starting to be sown, I think personally, it's probably easy for me to say now, that's where it needs to be ironed out. I think the issue now they've got is, I mean, I don't personally feel though if you punish the driver or take him out for a seat, I don't know if a team can do that, if they can put in the reserve driver for one race. And
yes, they can. Yeah, it's their choice whether they sit in the car, but it's obviously detrimental to their race if they do it.
You could say that, but then I suppose they still have another car running, and it would be very interesting to slap another driver in straight away to see how he actually performs. I mean, from my personal perspective, I think that, you know, if he'd have still done it, and one of the clear contract agreements from 2010 or whatever, or agreements that they had with the team was that you would sit out a race if you disobeyed a direct team order, that the reserve driver, which I believe is Buemi, would come straight into the seat for that one race. Is a much bigger punishment, because a driver doesn't want a third driver coming in straight away, does he? Especially if he's performing better out of the two usual cars, to sort of show him up. So it'd be quite a big punishment. But then again, why would Sebastian Vettel then come back into the car and have the ump for the rest of the season or not perform, because he's only doing himself in?
Yeah.
So, you know, personally, I feel it's still an effective punishment. But yes, you do potentially take out one of your better drivers as a result for one race, which I completely agree, you know, does have an impact. So it's a tricky scenario, but I think ultimately, from my perspective, I think if you agree this very specifically and concisely up front, I think you avoid it, or the driver has to, as a matter of respect and factual agreement, you know, take the punishments that come their way. But I think it's quite clearly now that from recent conversations I think had with the head of Red Bull, that, you know, the team orders are going to be quote unquote reduced.
Yeah, I think that as well, from reading some of the stuff that come out just afterwards with sort of people's tweets and things like that. I think Martin Brundle had quite a good idea where he said he wouldn't get rid of team orders completely, or he alluded to the fact he wouldn't get rid of team orders completely, but he would have in both the drivers' contracts, you're free to race to the best of your abilities. If you crash, you then share basically all the costs of the damages of the car, anything you've lost the team in revenue. And if it then has a knock-on effect to losing anything else in ways of any money, basically, they then have to make it up from their own pockets, which I thought that's quite a good way of doing it, because it's not exactly a fine. You're actually going to lose the value of what you've done. So the more serious the incident is, and of course, damaging two Formula One cars, the bill for repairing those isn't going to be cheap. So it's probably going to be bigger than any fine they could impose anyway. So maybe I thought that was an interesting slant on maybe a different way of going about a punishment, just like say setting the ground rules for this is exactly what will happen, and it might be monetary, it might be, like say, just a course of action that's already predefined before the race even goes ahead.
It is, but I wonder whether it's hard. It's quite hard to realise the revenue lost as a result of, say, something which might have caused the team a championship or a title.
I suppose you could take it as points value, and then you add the points in that they would have got. Say they finished in the positions they were in, like 1 and 2. If they lost the 1-2, you take the points out, and then I think you could equate a value to the amount of points that you lost. I think that's probably what Martin Brundle was getting at. I think
it is an interesting point, but I suppose, can you always be sure that you're going to get a black and white situation where you can pin the fault on either the driver or the other driver or the team?
I would say that if in any situation, even if unless it was clear one of them rammed into the side of the other one, if one of them chose not to back off, as in everybody says it's been Vettel being over aggressive on Webber and Webber not backing off, but I would say that the not backing off is just as good as being the one that's attacking in the first place. And if that's a situation that comes out, and like I say, unless one rams into the other, both should just share the blame equally, I think, in that situation.
I suppose the black and white scenario, you could say, is whether it's a not following of team orders, of which I suppose the only thing you've got to clarify with the drivers is the situation where they might not have understood, in inverted commas.
Yeah, that's it. I think that, like say, the defence that Vettel jumped to.
Yeah,
in this particular circumstance.
Yeah,
but sort of moving it on slightly from that, do you think that shows a weakness in Christian Horner's leadership? The fact that he's now seen to have not imposed any punishment on Vettel, does that sort of kind of send the message that Vettel can disobey what is effectively his boss and then get away scot-free with it?
I do think a little bit, and for the reason why I say that is because I think now, of course, what you've now seen is actually, if anything, Vettel either influencing or contributing to the decision that team orders become reduced. So you see that an influence that, and this comes from the top of Red Bull though, so I don't think it's Christian Horner's decision that, okay, really we should be racing. Now, whilst I'm not saying for 1 second that team orders are a good idea or a bad idea, they are in varying degrees between the teams, implemented either, officially or unofficially, depending on what the truth is. But I think, I think personally, I think Vettel has influenced things, whether that was intentional or not. It has happened, and I think as a result, I think Christian Horner's authority has been undermined a little bit because he's been very much about follow the team's agreement. Vettel then just doesn't, and then as it's come out, it's been taken to the top. And the top have said, well, actually, from now on, it needs to be more like how Vettel behaved.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, we'll change the rules now afterwards to suit the situation that happened there and to stop it happening again. But like you say, swinging it most definitely in Vettel's favour.
I think so. But then I suppose now, from Webber's perspective, it's like, well, okay, now it's even ground again. And perhaps that. Apart from Ferrari, there are no other teams that I'm aware of that formally invoke a very strong team orders from the outset.
I think it'd be unfair to say there isn't any that do it. I don't think there's any that have come to the front that you've seen it. Because right, yeah. I would personally say if Grosjean and Raikkonen were closer together, Lotus would probably stick to Raikkonen as a very, very, very obvious number one and ask Grosjean to get out of the way for him. But the fact that
not
he's so far,
I
understand. I think the fact that he's so far ahead of him, we won't know if it's official or unofficial because the situation hasn't arisen. So it's only where Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes are the only teams really where both the drivers this season have been close enough together, well, of the top teams anyway, that you would see that clear number one, number two structure coming out.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's clear now. As I say, hopefully that it will mean that we'll really see them racing together where the situation, allows for it. And we'll just see if that works out better or worse throughout the season.
Yeah, I think we've saying about Christian Horner's leadership as well in the whole thing. I think that if he set a marker down now and said that, okay, you've done it once, Seb, you've had your telling off, and now we move on, don't do it again, basically. The real test of his leadership is going to come is if Vettel now disobeys team orders again in the future, and I think we just have to hold fire on his leadership until that happens again, or if that happens again. And then we'll see what he does then. If he caves in again, I think he's lost any kind of credibility as a boss, and that may even be the sort of thing that would push him over the edge, and he would actually have to resign his post if it happened again and he didn't do anything.
It's a tricky one because, I suppose everyone's got their own style of leadership, etc., and some people are very hands-off, some people are very hands-on, and he suggests to me that he's very much more of a hands-off kind of, we'll let you go and do your thing.
But the problem is though, then, but if you have to if there is a case where you have to impose your leadership and it's not followed, then you can only be hands off to a certain point, I think.
You can, but then I suppose the other problem is the authority has been, in my opinion, diluted a bit as a result of the team orders are now no longer there. And to what extent are the team orders no longer there? When it really comes to it, and Vettel could win the season again this year, and Webber takes him out, then you could say, well, okay, that's not intentional, obviously, but if that's a scenario which happens because they're racing against each other, that could be a season decider. So we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, we'll lead on from a front-running team to a former front-running team now with McLaren. Do we think they can get back to winning ways and get to the front of the grid, or do we think that is pretty much their season done?
I'd say it's quite early to say. Three races in. I think we've been getting slightly mixed messages from since the Malaysian race, in my opinion, because I think McLaren team have been saying, okay, at the early stages of the week, okay, we're bringing some upgrades. We think we're looking forward to sort of improving the car, etc. And then when it got to practice, it was like, these aren't going to make a massive improvement here. And I think that was aligned to some of Button's quotes.
I think as well. Sorry, just to sort of jump in on you on that one as well. I think the problem that I'm seeing with what they've said now is as they bought the upgrades, they said a lot of them were reactionary to what they had found out as being their problem. So it does now make me wonder, have they even actually found out what the problem is, or have they found out what the problem is, they've not been able to sort it, or is the problem that they thought it was not even the problem, and there's maybe a more serious problem or something they still haven't seen in the car? So are they even looking in the right area still?
But I also believe, though, I think it was Sam Michael that said this in a BBC interview that actually at the paddock, I think during practice, he mentioned that we're bringing a combination of development upgrades, which are just a matter of the course at this stage of the race, and, as you said, reactionary updates. Now, my question is, what if those reactionary updates adversely affect the upgrades that were due to come anyway? Because, I mean, these things are all, are likely or could be joined up with each other. Are they actually risking making the problem worse?
I think as well, what we're seeing at the moment as well is they're not a little bit off the pace and at the back of the front running teams. They are actually, or at the races we've had so far, they're actually being challenged by the midfield teams, and in some circumstances the midfield teams are actually getting the better of them. Like Force India springs to mind. They seem a stronger team and have a stronger car and package as a whole than McLaren do this season. So that's a very, very long way to fall back. I personally don't think they can climb that far, because we know McLaren are good at development, but I think they need to have started off from a better base. They needed to have been maybe fourth fastest, and they could have brought their way back up to sort of the front maybe midway through the season. But I think they've started off so far back now that any development that they do, they're probably going to be only fighting to get back into the top running teams. I don't think they're going to be competing probably for the rest of the season unless they have some kind of major breakthrough with the upgrades.
Yeah, I think Martin Whitmarsh mentioned that there are some major ones coming, I think, ready for Spain. So I think I got the impression that he said the next couple of races, and referring to China as well, are still going to be challenging. Now, personally, I think after those upgrades, unless there are massive improvements, I think they do have to start looking at focusing on development for next year's car. I really do, because you're almost looking at a quarter way into the season.
Yeah, that's it. I think, and like I say, it's a good point. And the problem they're going to have is a lot of the other teams will all bring upgrades as well. That sort of when they come back to Europe, because it's close to their bases. That's the famous race that everybody gets massive upgrades when they come back to Spain, because it's the first one in Europe. They're only a matter of some of them. Well, I don't know. You could drive there in less than a day, whereas the other ones, everything has to be shipped out by plane. So everybody's going to be bringing upgrades to that race. So, like I say, I think that could be their last throw of the dice. If that doesn't bring them right back up into the field, I think they've got to write this season off.
What also perplexes me, I know this is a little bit off the topic, but about how it seems the development choice has been revolutionary, as you've mentioned on previous podcasts, rather than evolutionary. But what I can't quite seem to fathom is it revolutionary in preparations for next year's car, or was it just a big foundation change for this year?
I believe that actually I really wouldn't like to say. I think the changes next year are going to be too different. I don't think they could run cars that they've got this year in any real same kind of form for next year. But then why have they gone for revolutionary, like I say, rather than evolutionary, just to see it out? Maybe they have got half an eye on testing stuff for next year as well, possibly. I don't know. I do. If they can't carry some of this car over to next year with the new regulations, I cannot see any reason why they've gone totally revolutionary this year.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly have to see in the next few races, and I think certainly I think the only thing that I think they've got going for themselves at the moment is the fact that the car certainly doesn't seem to wear the tyres as much as some of the other more advanced teams at the moment, and I think they would probably look to be going on fewer stops as much as they can. As I say, both drivers are considered to be good at looking after their tyres as well, so I think that's their only hope really at the moment. Okay, so next up to discuss is Pirelli tyres again. The next part of what I know we've been discussing over the last few podcasts as well, but come to light even more so, I think, over this Chinese Grand Prix weekend. And the fact that really, is there a place in F1 for tyres that really only last a very short stint of laps, i.e. the softs that have been brought to this Grand Prix?
Yeah, that's it. This was the whole story again was just triggered off by the drivers' reactions after practice on Friday, where they run some tests in, and it was Lewis Hamilton, I believe, that said the tyres are literally just disintegrating after 2 or 3 laps and that all the life's gone in them. And when Pirelli run their own independent tests, they worked out that just at a standard rate of normal race, the tyres were only lasting 6 laps. So is there really place in the pinnacle of motorsport for tyres that only last 6 laps?
Yeah, this is the thing I know you've mentioned before about the Pirelli tyres, about how that looks in the wider scheme of things. If you're really into F1 and you're really into understanding the nature of the tyres, you'll understand that they're purposefully done like
Yeah,
this.
so that's that they're made to fall away
Yeah.
by design. They're not. It's
Yeah.
not a bad design.
But you've got to wonder about, generally across, the everyman or the every person that would look at this and say, oh, we know that there's been a lot of complaints about the tyres that they've been falling off, about what generally that has the reputation of the company, because...
Sorry, just jump on you. That's the problem. Even if you're looking at F1 from the outside, when you read in the newspaper something about F1, it's generally what the drivers are saying and the results of the race. There's not, and a lot of the drivers are saying these tyres are going off. That's
right.
The big thing that's coming out. There's no description in what the drivers are saying as to why they're going off. There's no background to say this is what Pirelli were asked to bring. Yeah, that's it exactly.
Yeah, and I think personally, whilst we did see the teams start to get a handle on it last season, or towards the end of the season, I should say, and the races were starting to become a bit processional. I think this year it's going a little bit too much the other way, and I think the argument or the point of view is becoming more stronger, in my view, that drivers are not racing as fast as they can often enough or for a long enough period in the races. It's getting more and more evident about tyre management.
Yeah, I said it's the I know it sounds like the same thing, but it's the driver that can get their car to the end of the race the quickest, as opposed to the driver that can drive the fastest that's winning the races now. That's right,
and whilst I don't agree with a lot of things that Jacques Villeneuve said in some of his impromptu discussions with BBC in the commentary this weekend. He did, needless to say, of the red glasses he was wearing, but he did allude to that point, that he said it's down to the I think he made the comment of the quickest driver rather than the fastest or something like that. And I do take his point in that, in isolation there, because I personally feel that you have to develop a tyre that obviously if it's soft, it will wear out quicker. If it's hard, it will last longer. Either or will obviously last longer accordingly, and I think there has to be quite a specific operating temperature. But what I don't think they should be continuing is this in between, where they're not wearing out but they're not getting the grip either, and they're losing the grip too quickly, in my opinion. And as you say, it just puts doubts in the drivers' minds. It stops them from driving as fast as they can. And if Formula One is about driving as fast as you can, it's starting to indirectly move away from that, isn't it? The principle of what the sport's about.
I think there's that, because you've got that sort of unknown area as well. If they don't know when the tyres are going to fall off the cliff, they can have a rough idea, but you can run as many simulations as you want and the tyres won't drop off at the same point. It all depends the kind of wear, the strain you put them through going through the race. And I think this is the big problem. What in an ideal world, what we would need from the tyres is, say for a 60 lap race, that you knew that your tyres were going to last 20 laps of going flat out. And if they didn't quite last, maybe you have to back up a little bit, but you don't want to be managing. You need more set parameters. They need to last a certain amount of time, and maybe if a driver pushes harder, they wear out quicker. But not this complete uncertainty. If we've got we've got no definite idea of when the performance is just going to suddenly drop off, and we're even going to struggle to get back to the pits to change them.
I think that's a very good point. Don't get me wrong, it's easy for us to say, because we don't have an idea as to how to technically implement it, as I'm sure Pirelli could do, but to other tyre manufacturers. But it does need to have this, albeit an understandably tricky balance between, as you say, making it robust enough to be within a certain amount of parameter, or to be within certain parameters.
Yeah, so that's what I meant. I probably wasn't clear enough on that as well. The fact that they've bought soft tyres to 2 races, and some of them they're going off after maybe 10 laps, and some of them they're going off after 6 laps. There's no consistency between what they're bringing to the races in terms of tyres.
Yeah, and I think, don't get me wrong, in some respects, we don't want to start going back to the processional races because the teams get too much of a good idea out of it. Like you say, perhaps with each tyre submission every year, the amount of wear overall is tweaked slightly. It's tweaked to the extent where it makes the difference, but not to perhaps the extent is our point that we're finding now, especially on the softer sets of tyres that we're finding. And that's causing, as you say, more, people to be cautious rather than looking to drive as fast as they can.
I think you still definitely need that element of not the unknown as such, but a little bit of the unknown that if I really push my tyres, they're going to go off quicker, and you don't know when they're going to go off quicker if you're pushing them. But at the minute, you're almost getting a lottery. You're not even pushing, and they're still going off quick. That's a weird kind of sort of scenario that we see coming up. And well, I think last year, before the teams got a hand on it, it was literally described as the tyre lottery. And you see people like sort of Williams and that, which was good for them winning last year. But I don't think it was on merit. I think it was, again, that tyre lottery, and that's the thing you don't really want. You want to bring it closer together, but you don't want just to make it a random throw of the dice as to who's going to win. Okay, we'll move on to our prediction section. So I'll start by asking Cole for his predictions. So who have you got down for pole for this race?
Okay, so I've got Lewis Hamilton down as pole. He's been a good qualifier so far this season, I think, and I'm banking on Mercedes bringing the upgrades needed to ultimately taking first place. And obviously I'm factoring in the fact that typically Red Bull on these high-speed straight tracks don't perform as well. Okay,
and who have you got for the win?
Well, I'm actually going to go for Rosberg. I know that's a bit of a strange one, but I'm going to say that he's going to qualify very close to Hamilton as well. And I think after the last race, I'm by no means saying that Hamilton will let him pass, but I think he'll have that extra.
Well, Rosberg definitely seems to have the race pace, doesn't he? So.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm going back on race pace, but also the extra grit and determination to win through this time round. Okay, now Tony, for your predictions. So who do you think's going to be the pole sitter?
Okay, I'm going to go with Rosberg for pole, I think. It's a difficult one because I know he put the perfect laps in the perfect conditions last year.
Season, yep.
I don't think we're going to see that from him again this year, but I think he likes the track. He obviously knows it because, like I say, he managed to put together that perfect lap. And I think Mercedes have got definitely the one lap pace this year.
Okay, so who do you think's going to win the race?
I'm going to go for Fernando Alonso, I think, because they've looked fast in the practice sessions. And we all know they're good at starts, so all they've got to do, as long as he doesn't have a qualifying disaster and he qualifies somewhere near the front, I think he might get the jump at the front and then possibly just stretch out the lead. Okay, now for Jess's predictions, who do you think is going to be fastest on Saturday?
Jenson Button.
And who do you think is going to win the race on Sunday?
Lewis Hamilton.
Okay, now moving into qualifying and Q1, there was very little action from any team in Q1 really, but with the drivers that are out there, both the Caterhams are at the back and then both Marussias, and then Bottas and Gutierrez filled the top slots.
Yeah, I think this was order of the day was tyre saving here, I think, and it showed from when I watched it live and then looked back at the highlights, and I think they showed the highlights of the pit lane opening at 20 minutes and then it suddenly clicked through to about 12, I think, as the first car come out. So 8 minutes of just sat there not doing anything.
There's another strong performance from Bianchi, who is quickest of the small teams again.
And by quite some margin again as well. Both the Marussias out-qualified both the Caterhams once again, has now become kind of the way things are just going this season. Yep, that's it. And Bianchi was actually 7/10 up, or just under 7/10 up on his teammate Max Chilton as well.
And very fast behind the pace of the Sauber that was in front of him. I think it was roughly about 8/10 off the pace.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Gutierrez is. I think he's still learning and suffering a little bit, so that's maybe not his true pace, but still, we're not the 2 to 3 seconds behind that we'd seen from Marussias in previous years. They're right up on the tail now, and it just shows that it's only going to take an off day from maybe Toro Rosso, Williams, or the Saubers again, and Bianchi might actually be getting up into Q2 through his own merit.
Do you think that's a constant target for Marussia, do you think, to get into that Q2?
I think it has to be. I don't think they're quite there yet, but I think it has to be becoming more and more sort of relevant target as they go along. Okay, and that leads us into Q2, where the big story was Mark Webber being disqualified for not having enough fuel left in the car to provide a sample.
Yeah, so I understand they wanted to, quote, I think, quarantine the fuel Bowsers. So the only Bowser I know of is the one in Nintendo. So I don't know what that's all about. I believe it's something to do with the fuel pressure. But
perhaps they did indeed have Bowser from Nintendo on the fuel Bowser, and that's where it went wrong.
That's the problem. Yeah, it must have been. But Yeah, so it looked like whether that was truly the problem. I remember seeing some of the engineers look at the fuel pump machine, with the technical term, but yeah, just registering whether it's actually put in the fuel it had done, or whether they've just run it too close to the mark. It's we'll never know 100% for certain, I think. But
it was officially said that it was mechanical failure in the interview, but like I say, whether that is the case or whether it's finger trouble as they call it.
Yeah, indeed.
But yeah, I believe. It was quoted. I think obviously you have to provide 1 litre of fuel for a sample. And when Webber pulled up his car, and I say this is unconfirmed, this is what I saw, he only had 150 millilitres of fuel left in there. So it was debatable as to whether he would have even got back to the pits, let alone had. Well, he wasn't going to provide a full fuel sample. That's for sure. So.
Indeed. Do you always have to provide a fuel sample at the end, or do you only when it's requested?
No, you always have to provide it. It has to be.
Oh, right.
Everyone has to give a litre of their fuel, bar none.
Right.
And it's basically just to check that they're using the right type of fuel, and basically, they haven't put some kind of souped-up rocket fuel in there. But
yeah, so Webber's woes continue, I guess. But
yeah, indeed.
Yeah,
the one thing that I don't quite understand about this is how, at the pinnacle of motorsport in this day and age, I know they've got the technology to deliver a very specific amount of fuel, but why they can't have a removable tank that they weigh before they put the fuel in the car, register what's supposed to go in there, and then weigh it again just to make sure it has delivered at least within the area of what they expect, because they were sat around in the pit lane for long enough that procedure wouldn't have taken more than 20-30 seconds, and then they would have been back out. It might have delayed them another 30 seconds while they put more fuel in, but surely that's got to be better, having just a little manual check before they go out than letting the car go out and run out of fuel, because we've seen it happen 3 times in 2 seasons now. We've had Hamilton, Vettel, and now Webber that it's all happened to.
Are you able to weigh the car when it's out on the grid?
No, just I was thinking more. You maybe have a removable tank in
I see. Right.
in the fuel delivery system, and then you know what the tank weighs when you put it on there. You put the fuel in the car, then you weigh the tank, and then you take out what was in there from what's left in there, and then you get the fuel that you've delivered, basically. Some manual measure of how much fuel has left this tank, basically. But I don't know, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but I just don't understand why it all has to be done by machine, and there's no manual check that they can do to make sure when they've clearly got the time, because everyone sat in the pits for at least 5 minutes before going out. So.
Yeah, indeed, and machines are fallible as well. So
and I say it seems to be happening more and more now, because we've seen it happen to Lewis Hamilton last season, Vettel last season, and now Webber this season. So that's 2 years and 3 occurrences. It's not commonplace, but at the pinnacle of motorsport, I think it's more common than it probably should be.
So moving on to the rest of the qualifications and the dropouts over this period. So we also lose Verne, Maldonado, Perez, and both Force Indias.
Yeah, I think not too much surprising there. Maybe Perez a little bit surprising, but considering McLaren's woes, as we spoke about earlier on, I think probably Button done a little bit better than he maybe should have done in getting into the top 10, and Perez was probably, what do you think, just about where he should have been?
Hard to say, really. I suppose it depends on what ideas they have, because the attention, I suppose, is less focused on them in the middle of the pack at the moment, on what the plans were around, doing a certain type of qualifying for the race, perhaps. But I suppose I think he should have at least been getting into Q2. I think personally,
like I say, he probably should have been aiming at, even if it was just 10th place and maybe not even running Q2, at least get there. Yeah, I agree with you on that one.
But the surprise of the session... Sorry, go on.
So, no, I was just going to say on Perez as well, maybe to cut him a little bit of slack as well, he's in a new team, he's still learning as well. Perhaps he's still just getting used to things in the car and the general way that things are there.
Indeed, but I think the surprise of the session was Ricciardo finishing 9th, getting into Q3, which was a big surprise from Button over the team radio.
It even received a small wow from Button that he was in the top 10, and put in a competitive time as well. It wasn't just that he scraped in and happened to be best of the other teams and maybe benefited from Perez being a bit lower down. He actually did put in a competitive time as well.
Yeah, he certainly seemed a relaxed figure, at the time when he's been interviewed afterwards as well. So, perhaps he is being touted as a potential Webber replacement in the future. Certainly, if he carries on, because I think he started off quite well last season as well, and then dropped off, and you could tell his evident frustration. So, I think if he continues this sort of qualifying going forward, I think he's got a pretty good chance.
Yes, and I would have to go and check it completely, but I believe he may have even had 2 retirements this season, so we've not seen truly where he actually finishes as well, sort of his true race performance from start to finish. But I say I would have to check that, but I have a suspicion he may have retired both the first 2 races.
Okay, coming into qualifying 3 now, and very little action for the vast majority of Q3 as all teams choose to save the tyres, which I presume is as a result of the degradation with the softs. As a result, Vettel, Button and Hulkenberg elected not to set a fast lap, so are able to start on the harder prime tyres in the race.
I think this was it, because Pirelli were predicting the tyres were only going to last six laps under race conditions. So I think people chose to only set 1 flying lap so they could at least try and push them as far as possible to give them the best chance of only having to do a minimum number of stops then for the hard tyres, rather than literally everybody diving into the pits at the end of like lap 1 or lap 2.
So just very quickly then, so what are the rules on around how they're supposed to behave in qualifying?
Okay, basically what they do is once they get into the top 10, anyone outside of the top 10, they can start on whatever tyre choice they want. They've got completely free reign of it. Anybody in the top 10, they have to start on the tyres that they set their fast qualifying lap on. So of course, as the only one of those 3 that started on the hard tyres was to set a time was Button. And what he done was he just set a very slow time on the hard tyres. So he didn't take any life out of them, basically. All he done was registered a time to get himself ahead of Vettel and Hulkenberg. But because Vettel and Hulkenberg didn't set any times at all, they have no timed lap on any tyre for that last session. So they're then effectively allowed to start on whatever tyre they want because they never set a qualifying lap.
Eddie Jordan made a comment that, in his view, I think if you don't set a qualifying lap, he feels that there should be a rule in place to force people to start on the soft tyres. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that'd be one way of going about it, because then people don't get the choice and they have to then just be set on them tyres, so they can't change their strategy. Or maybe another thing they could look at doing is just giving back qualifying tyres like we've had in the past before, where once your qualifying's done on the set of tyres, you basically just chuck them out and you everybody gets a fresh set and can start on what they want anyway.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, because I think one of the things that has also been noted though is that obviously as a result of why these tyres are particularly difficult is it's, in a way, I feel it's good variance between the teams. That some people, some drivers taking a different strategy, others going for the options, for example, and I think that makes for an interesting race. So I don't know whether there's ever going to be a happy medium where you can get this level of variance in qualifying and different race setups, because that does make things interesting, but also not spoil the race as a result of the. I think
they could still do that in qualify with the qualifying tyres, because they would still maybe they get a brand new set of what they qualified on. So if you qualified on hard, you could have a brand. You don't have to start on the tyres you qualified on. But like say you would probably still see people, even if given the free choice, they would still split the strategies, I think, to try and do something a bit different.
Yeah, so you almost want to adjust the rules, I think, to give people certain parameters to work within. I think that should be the principles in which they should set these things out. So because obviously the teams are naturally going to try and think, well, actually, I think it might be slightly better for us if we did X, and other teams might be thinking Y, and I think that's how they want to go forward.
And I think that this is the problem. I think the idea in principle when these rules were set down was good, because the tyres were a bit more robust. There was less of this, we have to save it in qualifying to have it in the race. There was that wasn't an issue when these rules were set, and maybe the rules have become a little bit out of date now, and the tyre compounds out how they are now. What happens in qualifying is bleeding over too much into the race, and everybody is thinking about what they're going to be doing in the race rather than what they're going to do in qualifying. So qualifying is now suffering for the sake of the race rather than it being a balance of the two.
Very much so. I think I think it's just a case of the rules just not necessarily as I suppose per usual, catching up with the other decisions of the racing to keep things more interesting. And I absolutely agree. I think that's an interesting point that we should probably carry through for the rest of the season is, how do the rules, or how can the rules be adjusted, or going into future seasons, or what the likelihood would be based on what we're starting to find with this season, that there's just such a high variance of tyre degradation and graining.
Yeah, I think that's it. That they need. I think they just need to, even if they don't change. Well, they do need to maybe tweak the rules a little bit. I think they just have to reassess the rules for the situation with the tyres that they have now, as opposed to the rules were set when the tyres were different in the past. I just think they need to reevaluate it a little bit, and I don't think it will take a lot of change, but maybe just a tweak to the rules will bring it all back into context and back into how it should be.
So, in terms of the teams that decided to use the option tyres, they opted to only set one flying lap to save as much life in the tyres as possible, as we said. So I think, but what that meant was we had a long period of nothing happening, and then everyone hitting basically, which looked like a one hot lap, which I thought was quite exciting. I thought I'd quite like to see that, although it did use up a lot of the qualifying, and I think what we saw was the drivers that made the fewest mistakes ended up being at the top, really, which probably is the reason why some people could think that it skewed the results at the front a little bit.
Yeah, I think there was one interesting thing that came out as well, because we had, of course, Raikkonen setting the first fastest time, then Hamilton set a time that was faster than that, and then every other driver who then subsequently put their lap in couldn't beat either of those two. But it was interesting to see that Hamilton's lap, he wasn't far. At no point over the qualifying was he faster or the fastest in any section, any sector over the track. He basically just
put it together.
Yeah, because they were all only doing one flying lap. Basically, what had happened was nobody got it perfect in that one lap, and he just happened to get it the best out of all of them. He just strung made his best three sectors together in that. So he done well in doing that, but maybe not a true reflection of the Mercedes pace, because maybe Ferrari, had they had another flying lap, they may have actually finished higher than him in qualifying.
Okay, so in terms of the qualifying order, we had Hamilton on pole, as we said, with Raikkonen second. Alonso finished third, followed by Rosberg, Massa, Grosjean and Ricciardo in that order. So certainly hats off to Ricciardo.
Yeah, definitely. That was he was the slowest of the option ones, but again his time was still competitive, and because Vettel, Hulkenberg and Button didn't set those competitive laps, that obviously put him up into 7th place, which was I think his highest qualifying ever. So well done to Ricciardo there.
Very much so. The Toro Rosso seemed to be quite competitive in qualifying wet pace in was it Malaysia, when it was a little bit damp and changeable. But this is the first example, I think, of them being quite competitive on a dry track. So yeah, good for them.
Yes, and it'll be quite interesting as well now to see how, hopefully, if Ricciardo has a trouble-free race and doesn't have any problems with the car, where he can actually bring that car home, because it does look like it's got genuine pace this weekend. Okay, so that's qualifying finish, and that leads us on to the race. We had a great start from both Ferraris, as pretty much we've come to expect from them now.
Fantastic start, yeah.
And again, not just from one of them, from both of them this time, both from flying off the start, as the Lotus of Kimi Raikkonen seemed to bog down somewhat as he tried to pull away from the line.
It was, I suppose. I know I probably contradicted what I've just said as well, but I don't know. Is it a combination of the fact that Raikkonen's start was particularly poor with the wheel spinning, or do you think it was still the fact that there was nothing he could have done, and Ferraris were still going to go ahead of him because their starts are so good?
The only thing that I think we can really use from a gauge, or to gauge that, is the start of Hamilton. He either made a blisteringly quick start as well, or he just defended it very well, because obviously he managed to maintain his lead into the first corner.
Just about.
Yeah, that's it. That's yeah. So I think it was a bit of both. I don't think it was a horrendous start by Raikkonen, but it obviously wasn't the best. And with both Ferraris flying, as I think it was probably a 50-50.
Just makes me wonder about why. I mean, honestly, I suppose if this was even possible, the other teams would be doing it already. But why they don't analyse the Ferrari starts, about if they can look at it and see about their rev state, or how they prepare for the race on video footage, because I'd be interested to see how they do it. I mean, I suppose a lot of it is actually under the hood, as it were, and isn't visible or isn't audible.
Yeah, and being computer controlled as well. You have to rely on it's what you've set into the computer as to when the car's it's not launch control as it used to be. When the car is actually going to launch, they engage the clutches, and it's down to the driver obviously to disengage them and get forward momentum in the car, but a lot of it's all computer controlled, so it's a program that will do a lot of it for you. It's not, the drivers don't have to rev manually to a certain degree or anything like that. That's all computer controlled, and it's only once they've started does the driver's sort of manual control of the car truly kick in.
So yeah, because it's very interesting because as far as Ferrari are concerned, they've really got this nailed, and
it's not just because the car's fast away. It's very consistent. It's both cars are pulling away very quick, and they're doing it. They've obviously got it so they don't ever seem to spin their wheels. They've got all the parameters just right all of the time. So I don't think it's something based on the car like that. I think it's something they're doing as opposed to something physical with the car.
Absolutely. So I mean, as we go into the lights out piece itself, we have Hamilton just about holding off the Ferraris until the beginning of lap 5, where of course with DRS kicking in, he was a bit of a sitting duck, and I think I believe on the commentary I was listening on the BBC that it was just a factor that it looked like Lewis wasn't able to obviously achieve the 1 second gap before then, which I think was ultimately telling.
Yeah, I think DRS definitely played a factor in the overtake, but I think that Lewis was always going to be falling back into them because it looks like the Mercedes is definitely harder on its tyres than the Ferraris and the Lotuses. They seem to be able to hold on to them a little bit better, and I think his tyres were always going to go off first, and he was always only going to be going backwards towards that Ferrari.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of the Mercedes and its tyre life, I think that, in my opinion, that I think it's a couple of laps shorter in terms of tyre wear than the other teams.
Yeah, I think so, because I'm not sure what Alonso managed before he come in. I'm not sure whether he come in at the end of lap 6 or the end of lap 7. So obviously it's quite short on those soft tyres, but they were, even when they moved on to the hard tyres, Lewis was still in 2 or 3 laps before. So yeah, I think on the soft tyre, I think they probably managed at least an extra lap.
It seems like I get the impression that, so for example, Lewis Hamilton has a certain percentage of grip. It seems that he has a much sharper drop off earlier than the other teams. So yeah, the other teams are getting that drop off from the sounds of it, as you say, because they lap shortly afterwards. But then they're getting a smoother plateau of grip or performance.
And I think that shows as well by every time that Lewis Hamilton came out on a fresh set of tyres, he instantly set fastest laps for the next couple of laps, and then his times went back to very average. I don't think that was I don't think that was him pushing too hard and taking the life out of the tyres. I think that was more a case of, like you say, he was experiencing a much sharper drop off just through normal race wear, so he was able to go that bit quicker, but for not longer. So yeah, the Mercedes car seems to be very fast for a very short space of time, and whatever's making it fast is also seems to be eating those tyres up a lot quicker.
Absolutely, certainly more for Mercedes to look at in the next couple of races. Moving on, I think obviously there seems to be an error by Gutierrez at the end of lap 5.
One that he admitted to as well. He made no tried to make
no argument.
You've got
much choice, have you really?
I don't know. I've heard some very elaborate excuses, but yeah,
true.
He didn't try to find one. He just accepted it. So.
Yeah, that's true, and it very reminds me very much of Michael Schumacher in Singapore last year. It just kind of sort of the whole way the crash occurred and how it panned out seems to suggest that. And as you said, I think that's tipping your hat to driver excuses. But I do wonder. Something occurred to me when I saw that again. We are seeing recently over the last couple of seasons. Rookies make mistakes, and of course it's to be expected because they're rookies, but they do seem to be making quite, in my opinion, larger mistakes, and I'm wondering whether the lower formulas really prepare them for Formula One as they perhaps previously did. It seems to be a bigger gap that they have to jump to, especially in terms of speed and variables that they have to contend with in the Formula One car.
I think that you can definitely see that coming through, that they are definitely making, like you say, maybe not more mistakes, but definitely bigger, more noticeable mistakes. And
yes,
what seems to catch a lot of the rookie drivers out is how heavy and unstable Formula One car is under the pure load. It's almost like they sit the qualifying laps with no fuel in. As soon as they fill up with fuel and heavy, they then struggle to get to grips with how different the cars are feeling. So I don't know whether that's something the lower formulas can prepare them for. Or it may even be that the lack of young driver testing and in-season testing, where they would normally cut their teeth, as it were, in Formula 1, has been taken away from them. They can't get that idea of just how the car's going to handle anywhere else apart from in a race. So it's almost like a training ground when it shouldn't be. They should already be trained. So maybe they need to look at, even if it's not bringing back bringing back in-season testing, maybe having a look at giving, possibly having more young driver tests, because they do have the young driver tests. Maybe they need to be looking at having more of those, possibly.
Very much so, because I think, just as I say, the impact of that, not only is it perhaps less safe, but it looks like Gutierrez is going to receive a 5-place grid drop at the next race as punishment for the incident. So, whilst I'm not trying to relinquish any blame as such, I'm saying that it is an unfortunate occurrence for him, because it's only just going to hurt him and the team.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And again, is this... it's obviously hurting him as he's going to receive the 5-place grid penalty, but can you really punish somebody for learning, or should you be finding another way for them to learn as opposed to punish them because they didn't really know what to do in the situation, if you kind of get my point there?
Yeah, I think they need to be a little bit more open and honest and say, well, don't just say, oh, it's my mistake, it won't happen again in the future. Is it something consistent? And I think personally, if we start getting more rookies making those kind of mistakes, I think someone, whoever is in the authority to do so, actually start getting them together and asking these questions openly and say, right, transparency here, guys. What are you finding? What are your challenges?
Yep.
And seeing what they say.
And I think it's another argument as well for maybe having not necessarily just ruling out all rookies and putting them in the same basket. Maybe having a look at the rookie drivers that are getting their ticket into Formula One through sponsorship as well, rather than actually proven up, and maybe they have to have shown that they've won championships before the teams can actually give them a race seat as well, rather than because they've maybe finished third in a different championship and bring some money to the team. That maybe doesn't automatically qualify. Maybe they need stricter rules of actually how they get into Formula One. Maybe it's not a case of if a team will give you the drive, you're allowed to be in there. It's that you have to sit. Well, you have to meet certain requirements before you get there. Like I think it was David Coulthard said today that maybe they need to look at making the super license test, or the prerequisites for the super license a bit tougher than what they currently are, to try and maybe make the younger drivers stay a little bit longer and learn a little bit more before they make the jump up to Formula One. Okay, and we had a not-so-rookie driver also making a mistake as well, where Mark Webber crashed into the side of Jean-Eric Vergne because he tried to come up the inside and go around the corner when Vergne had already committed to the corner, and basically both drivers left with nowhere to go.
Yeah, I mean, when I first looked at this, unfortunately, I must admit, and I've slapped myself on the wrist for this already, my first instinct was, Vergne, what are you doing? It looked from a certain camera angle, we just cut into him. But when you look at it, I personally, in my view, when you look at it from a certain angle... just go back. I think you're right there in a way that I think he did cut in on him, but the problem was he had already made the decision to come in when Webber had made it was kind of, they both committed at the same time and there was nowhere either of them to go. So he did cut in, but it wasn't his fault, maybe. Yeah, this is it. I think he perhaps made a little bit more room than normal. But I suppose if you look at it, if he's on the line and he's into the corner already, with all intents and purposes on a technical basis, I think Webber has slightly T-boned him a little bit. It did look similar, not exactly the same by any stretch of the imagination, but when Maldonado hit Lewis Hamilton in a race last year, and forgive me, I can't remember the race itself, but Valencia. Thank you. So. Yeah, it had that kind of feel about it, and I think afterwards Mark said that he thought he had a bigger gap than he did, and I think that accurately describes what you were saying about it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but it certainly looks like though that obviously Mark's got the punishment for it, so
he receives a 3-place grid drop for the next race.
Yeah. So it's a tricky one, but I think ultimately he came off the one of the worst for it as well. And so course,
I was sorry, carry on.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say he's ended up paying the price as a result, and for the next race, so it doesn't get much better for him.
No, that's it. And I was just going to lead it on really to that then actually leading ultimately to his retirement, because he was then obviously forced to come in for a change of nose. Subsequently then had a change of tyres as well, just because he was in the pit really, just to get a fresh set. And it turned out that his right rear tyre was not attached properly, and then had completely become unattached from the car by the end of the lap.
Yeah, I mean, there was quite a few theories as to why that was allowed to happen. Gary Anderson mentioned that there were typically some procedures in place previously to stop that happening to ensure that the wheel nuts are sealed, but then mentioned that they'd been taken off and we weren't sure why that was the case. Obviously to ensure that it was fixed.
Sorry, what Gary Anderson was saying was the manual tethers that they used to do. So
right.
Now the tethers are actually automatic. They lock as the wheel nuts lock in.
Right,
and
there's no manual check.
No, there's no. Well, they actually had to manually lock them before. They actually had to manually tether them, which they don't do anymore. It's now an automatic procedure, and that's what's been taken away is that manual procedure that Gary Anderson did allude to. Maybe they need to start thinking about bringing those manual tethers back so they know it's done before the car goes out.
Yeah, possibly, as I say, because otherwise you're never quite guaranteed that it's not that the tyre isn't gonna fly off, you know.
This was the case today as well, because in Red Bull's statement about the incident, they said that they didn't actually know that the tyre hadn't gone on properly. It was only when it came loose that they knew that it wasn't attached properly. It wasn't a case of like we've seen with other teams where the car's actually driven away and the wheel's been loose and the mechanics have known straight away because they've put their hands in there and said, look, I've not tightened the wheel nut. Red Bull thought they had done everything in that car and they thought it had gone on. According to their statement, they thought that the wheel nut had gone on. They didn't know until it came off that there was any problem with it.
So moving on, that's unfortunate for Webber, as I say, because I think that's obviously just put paid to a quite challenging weekend. Raikkonen attempted to overtake Perez, and of course he smacked Perez from behind.
Yep. More contact and a damaged nose as a result again.
Yeah, very much so. I looked at this a couple of times really, and whilst I think Perez does move over, Raikkonen is obviously quite aggressive with that as well. He's under pressure himself as well, and it's hard to say really who's at fault, in my opinion, really there, because as I say, you have a potentially underperforming McLaren at the moment, and he goes on obviously on the outside, especially when it's up on the curb. He's got two wheels on the track at the time, and it's a bit of a tricky one, but he didn't seem to have been too badly affected by it.
And as well, in Perez's defence, he never actually left the racing line as well, which is, I think, subsequently why he hasn't received a penalty for that. It was just, that was classed as a racing incident purely because Perez didn't leave the racing line. Raikkonen got squeezed, but it was a gap that was always going to disappear, so he either had to get past or he had to give up the move, and he kind of got stuck in between, and that's why he got hit. But like you say, the nose coat, the damaged nose of the car, and losing a big chunk of his front wing as well didn't seem to affect him too badly, as he was still catching the cars in front of him and doing a fairly respectable pace even straight after that, and pretty much through to the end of the race, because he called for a new nose and they didn't actually change it at Lotus.
It's tricky because, I mean, you think that I think they've pretty much, Lotus have come out and no uncertain terms, or as much as they can, said that this car is designed for the averages of the dry weather in a lot of these races, or they're hoping to face. So I think we felt or hoped that the car was going to perform quite well at race day in dry conditions, and it's turned out to be the case. About whether he would have challenged Fernando even more if he hadn't had that damage, it's hard to say. And obviously the worrying thing for Mercedes is that they still couldn't quite catch him, as say, with a damaged nose. So it's interesting to see about all that potential the car has still. And I think from what some of the commentary was discussing, that I think the broken bit at the top isn't so bad because there's a hole typically in there anyway. There's just a bit more of it, and a lot of the air that's channeled, and the design of the car is channeled obviously via the front wing and on the wheels. So I think probably the bigger impact, or the biggest damage that will cause bigger impact to the car's performance, is probably around the broken front wing that we had.
Yes, I was going to say. I think that even though the carbon fibre, the nose was flapping about and maybe would have distracted Raikkonen a little bit, I think performance-wise that's all it was ever going to be, was a distraction. Like you say, the big damage was in that front wing. So, and even then, it still didn't seem to affect it that badly.
It's certainly seeming that we mustn't forget, though, that probably we'll come to this in a bit, I know, when we talk about Vettel, but Red Bull just aren't suited for these kind of tracks, in my opinion, and I think perhaps it's been a bit of a red herring in terms of the Red Bull's perhaps no longer dominating. I personally feel they're still the car to beat, but I think with Lotus's performance, I certainly puts them into the top three, or potentially even the top two, depending on how consistent Ferrari can be going forward. And it was another good performance for Raikkonen, very solid and very consistent. And I think that's what most of the top drivers need to concentrate on for the rest of the season.
Yeah, and I think comparing Lotus to Red Bull as well, you've got two different very ends of the spectrum there. You've got Red Bull being very fast up there, and maybe this season maybe eating their tyres a little bit more and wearing them out a bit quicker than they have done in previous seasons. And Lotus seems to be the other end, not blinding pace, but definitely they've got the longevity. They've definitely can eke those tyres out, and like we say, if that allows them to be a little bit slower but have to do one less stop, it's going to be a case of which is worth more, the pure speed on the track. Can you make up that extra stop? So it's going to be an interesting battle if they both carry on in that vein. And talking of Red Bull, that leads us on to Sebastian Vettel, who pitted very late for a brand new set. I think it was a brand new set anyway of option tyres, which left him a little bit behind Hamilton. But with the new rubber on the tyres, he was able to close the gap very quickly and led for a very exciting finish.
Yeah, I must admit it was. I thought he or Red Bull hadn't left enough laps left or left tarmac in the race to really catch him, but it proved wrong. I think Red Bull are showing their competency with taking calculated risks and showing very good strategy. And I think really, if that scenario had been played again, you could well have seen Sebastian Vettel overtake Lewis in the final corners.
I think saying on that as well, I think it's fair to say they made the best of a very bad situation, because this track definitely didn't suit their car. They were never really on the pace, never looked to be up the front. So to have almost sneaked a podium, like I say, I think it was a masterstroke of strategy for them. Yeah, which leads back to my original point that I still think they're the car to beat. The track, in my opinion, and seems to have been the case over the last few seasons. The car doesn't seem to have been designed for straight line speed tracks. It seems that Adrian Newey tends to favour a design that generally, on average, seems to favour fast and slow corners to increase the general lap time of the car. So yeah, basically the long and short of it is they're always going to be a disadvantage in these kind of races. And yet, as you say, they still nearly snatched the podium. And he nearly did it, and it was very, very close. And I think it's two things really. It shows the Mercedes with what I feel seems to be tyre problems. Although I don't know. I mean, obviously, I can never really tell just based on sound, but it did seem that the acceleration of the car wasn't as perhaps responsive as some of the other cars. I don't know if you noticed anything like that at all, or that was just me, but. It seemed, I don't know whether that can be tyre based, but the Mercedes very much doesn't, seems to struggle towards the end of the race with worn tyres, and Vettel was very close. Yeah, one thing I did notice on that, every time the pack closed up and the sort of Lewis Hamilton was around another group of cars, especially the ones he was racing with, all of them seem to be able to accelerate out of the corners a lot faster than the Mercedes. So I don't know whether they've got a fundamental problem with the accelerating away, or maybe he just can't get the power down early enough, because maybe a lack of downforce compared to the teams that they're racing, like the teams that are up there, and it may be that lack of downforce which is actually costing them the speed. I did wonder if it was downforce, yeah. It certainly seems that Hamilton seems to be bemoaning the lack of pace. As you say, well, what he means by that, we're not 100% sure, but yeah, it certainly seems like there's something there that they need to improve on. Having said that, though, if they can still get a podium, then that's still good news at the moment with McLaren's woes. But going back to sort of how Vettel was still able to catch him as a result, I personally think if Vettel hadn't made those errors on the last couple of corners where he slid a little bit, or I think he overcooked some of the corners, I think he could have overtaken them. Whether that was as a result of his own tyres going off because he's pushing so hard on them, I'm not sure. That's exactly what I was going to say. Maybe he's actually taken the life out of the tyres in pushing that hard just to catch up Hamilton. By the time he got there, he didn't have any tyres left. But it'd be a fascinating thing to try and know that, if they could ever get that out of Vettel later on, because I suppose you would like to say it was down to the tyres rather than your own mistakes. But it just goes back to our original point about the tyres coming off so quickly. If you can't push as hard as you can and not be rewarded for it, is obviously a question that I think should be raised. But no, it was very very close at the end, and I thought it was the most exciting part of the race, actually, that piece, because it really was an incredible comeback by them. Yeah, I definitely think so. Of course, we as well throw a Caterham into the mix as well. We had Lewis Hamilton calling for the blue flags, and him wanting to get that Caterham out of the way as quickly as possible, which maybe as well held him up a little bit. But I think Vettel had to take a bit of go slightly offline to get round it as well and I think he maybe didn't plan the best sort of part of the track to try and overtake that Caterham as well. So maybe that played a part in it. But so I think it definitely factored in, but I don't think it was the cause because obviously both cars had to get past that Caterham. So it's neither here nor there really. I don't think.
Yeah, I can kind of see it from Lewis's perspective, really. I suppose if you spend, if you start the race on pole position, and you then start to feel, I suppose, that gets eroded away, and then you're trying to fight for second, third, fourth, fifth place, depending on where the relevant drivers were at the time. But you're always perhaps trying to fight with Kimi Raikkonen, and you just can't overtake him. And then towards the end of the race, you find a Red Bull steaming up on you. I suppose you do. You probably are thinking, aren't you? Crikey, I'm wringing the life out of this car, and it just isn't competitive enough at the moment.
I do wonder as well if the early performance of Mercedes being better than what Lewis expected, maybe that's raised his hopes maybe a little bit falsely. He thinks there's a bit more pace in the car than he was possibly getting today, and say his hopes are raised that actually, no, it might not be as bad as I first thought. I don't need to aim for next year, and I might be in with half a shout this year. And maybe as he's seen cars that should have been on an equal footing or not much further than him just sailing off up the road, maybe that's brought him back down to earth a little bit in his expectations for the championship as well.
Yeah, very much so. I think, as I say, I think that the Red Bull sort of proved that. Obviously, bear in mind that I personally feel they make better decisions at the moment strategically as well. They seem to understand what their car can really do, and they just work around the strategy side of it. So I still think they are the car to beat. I think Red Bull are probably the car with the most potential and the most performance over the course of the race so far. I think you've then probably got Ferrari, I feel, because of the consistency. I think then you've got Lotus and Mercedes dependent on the track.
Yeah.
And you've probably got the others then, which are at the moment seems to be quite a bit of a scrabble. So you've probably got the top four teams there. Perhaps Red Bull slightly on their own still. So it's just a question of development and how far teams now want to go, I think, to develop the cars for this year, or whether they want, when's the cut-off point getting ready for next year.
I think as well when you look at Mercedes and you look at what they actually are achieving and what they're doing, I think they've got very good one lap pace, but that is also seems to be their downfall as well, because it does seem to be eating those tyres. It's a very fast car, but not for a very long amount of time. So that does seem that is almost, I think, what we've seen every race. It's put in a very good qualifying, but the tyres have faded very, very quickly and left it very vulnerable to the cars behind it, which again, that may have even been the reason that Vettel was able to close. If the Mercedes was a little bit better on its tyres early on, Hamilton might have been that far up the road that Vettel wouldn't have even seen him or been in with a shout of even getting close to him. So, well, as we said, Hamilton did hang on for that third place to finish the podium, which ended up with Alonso winning the race. And I think a very good performance with Alonso today. We've not really spoken about him much, but that's pretty much because for most of the race he was out on his own in a class of his own, I think, today. So
I agree, and I suppose in previous races and last season you could say, not in all situations, but a lot of the time, that Ferrari, being consistent as they were, took advantage of a lot of the bad luck or inconsistencies of the other teams. But I really do feel this race was when they were really very much solid, and they really deserved the victory off their own back, because
they won on merit, didn't they, today? They bought the car to win the race. They had the strategy right. Alonso was in the right frame of mind. He got that good start, and as soon as he'd overtaken Hamilton, I don't think anyone was catching him. He was up the road and gone then. So,
yep.
Yeah, I think just generally all round faultless performance from Ferrari today, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, that, and then obviously Kimi Raikkonen bringing home second place with a damaged car, which is, I think now we're starting to see a bit more of the Lotus's true pace again. It's starting to even up the odds of it. We had fast in Australia, not so fast out in Malaysia, back to China it seems fast again. So obviously the averages are now starting to weigh in its favour of looking like quite a fast car as well. So I think we definitely, Kimi Raikkonen, it wasn't a lucky win in Australia. I don't think he's going to be there or thereabouts for a lot more of the races this season.
I think so too, but I think that will. I think, as I said previously, I think the Lotuses seem to have been designed for dry, hot tracks. So I think that, providing that's the case, I think they'll continue to be consistently up there.
Okay, then, and that brings us on to just a quick roundup of where everybody else finished. Obviously, we had Vettel coming in fourth after Hamilton and that nice battle at the end that got everybody was on the edge of their seats for, I'm sure. Button bringing home the McLaren in 5th, which strategy helped him, doing one less stop than everyone else. But again, a very, very solid job from Button. He done everything he was asked of today, and brought the car home probably further ahead than it should have been.
Yeah, very much further than I should have been. I think obviously helped by the pit stop, but also the fact that, and again, I think this goes back to a point about car performance over tyre management, because the car clearly isn't competitive in terms of raw pace.
Yeah.
But you can still bring a car home in 5th.
Yeah.
If you can manage the tyres.
Yeah, I think that's it. Because what he's lost in time, he's made up in not stopping in the pits for that one last time.
And the car fundamentally isn't eating those tyres.
No, that's it. Yeah, it's doing a consistent pace rather than a quick pace that drops off quickly.
Whether that's the reason of why it's not competitive is, of course, a very variant factor, I think. But which is something I think even McLaren are looking into at the moment. But I suppose that's just evidence of how a car can technically, I suppose, in terms of qualifying, be in the middle of the pack, but then head up towards the front purely out of tyre management. And so that's something which I think needs to be rationalised, I think.
So and then after Button, we've got Massa coming in at 7th. Fairly ordinary day for Massa. Not really a lot of incident, not a lot gone on. Just got on with his race and got there. Ricciardo come in at 8th. Massa. Yeah, sorry, Massa come in at 6th, and Ricciardo he come in at 7th. So he finished where he qualified, which was a very, very good result for him. So.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I know we've covered Ricciardo already, but I think it's like with qualifying. I think it's if he can keep that consistency, or even there or thereabouts, I think he's got a good chance of at least either going to a better team or
maybe taking a
higher.
Yeah, I was gonna say possibly even maybe taking Webber's Red Bull seat.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, then, and coming in 8th after him was Paul di Resta. He had a little incident with Adrian Sutil that set him back. Within the first few laps, where they came a bit close together on one of the corners, and he managed to recover well. And again, good strong showing from Force India to get up into 8th. 9th Grosjean, so again fairly uneventful race. Didn't really see a lot of him. And 10th was Hulkenberg, who done okay. Had a little battle with Massa, and then I think he forgot to or was unable to disable his pit lane limiter as he came out with a little battle with Massa. So I think that might have set him back a little bit, but again, apart from that, fairly uneventful. And I think the only other thing we have to mention really is Jules Bianchi again at the back. He has consistently qualified well and brought the car home. Top of the back marker teams again. So still a lap down, so not quite the race pace gap that they had in qualifying. They weren't quite as close to the midfield teams at the end of the race as they were in qualifying, but again, they're still not by the huge gap that we were seeing last season. So maybe some good things to come for Murcia and Jules Bianchi in the coming races.
Okay, on to the Tech Explained section now, and we're going to look at KERS, which stands for the Kinetic Energy Recovery System. So over to Tony to explain what it is and how it works.
Okay, the KERS package consists of a device that's connected to the car's braking system, which recovers the energy that would be lost under normal braking, and it also consists of batteries that then store this charge. This power stored in the batteries can then be released by the driver as and when they see fit to provide a boost in power to the car, basically giving an extra brake horsepower jump as and when they need it at the push of a button. The amount of energy that the drivers are allowed to use from this system is limited per each lap, and the amount of boost it actually delivers is also limited as well. So careful planning of when the boost is used can be a massive advantage for drivers. There are also pros and cons of running the system. One of the pros of running the system, you get the boost. The batteries can be used as ballast in the car as well, rather than just dead weight ballast that they use to fill it out if they haven't got that in the car. And some of the cons as well is the reliability. We've seen particularly Red Bull having some maybe not a dodgy KERS system, maybe the implementation of the KERS system they've got, but they've had KERS and in races it's cut out, they've lost it and caused intermittent problems. So you've got the reliability factor. There's also an effect on the brake balance as well. It harvests the energy from the brakes and can affect quite badly the brake balance, because obviously the energy that it's drawing can make it harder for the drivers to balance the brakes as they normally would. Also, you do have the problem of the batteries being quite heavy as well, so you may be limited to other things you can have on the cars. You may have to sacrifice some other parts of the car, basically just to get the weight of the batteries in there. And that brings us to the end of the podcast. We've run a little bit long this week as we've been trying to keep the podcast to around an hour and not been very successful so far. We've probably run into about an hour and 15 minutes on most occasions. So we will try. We'll see how we get on. But we're not going to cut anything out just to cut the time down. If we feel stuff should be included, it's going to be in there. So just really left to wrap up now. So you can visit our forums at www.lightsoutracing.co.uk. If you sign up there, you can get involved in the podcast, submit some news stories that you want us to talk about, or just some general feedback to the podcast, or anything else you want to see featured on the podcast. Our website is still currently in development, and we're hoping to get that open and running soon. We've had a few issues that have held us back on that, but we are still working on it. So I'm hoping to bring some news soon of that opening. If you would like to follow us on Twitter, we are at Lights Out Racing. And also as well, you can now email us at podcast@lightsoutracing.co.uk. And that's about all for our podcast, and I will leave you with our small selection of outtakes.
Okay, so moving on into the actual pole sitters, or the guys up in the front. I'll say that again. Can we cut that bit out?
Okay, and we'll go straight into the news roundup with the first story being more from the Multi-21 gate. Was Webber
Great start.
And the third story we'll be looking at is the
quite a long time, but has come to a massive head from last week's race. It wasn't last week's race. So we'll start again.
Okay, and now we'll go on to our prediction section where we will... Okay, and that leads us into Q2, where the big story was Mark Webber being disqualified for not having enough...
Oh dear.
And talking of...
Oh, for God's sake. Okay, so moving on now to the Tech Explained section. What is it?